being here. And first of all, I'm really, really happy that Jim Cohen, mi compañero, brought us into contact with Laura because she, and I'm going to read her, it was pretty much on the announcement for this event, which was called Up Against the Wall, U.S.-Mexico Relations in the Age of Trump, all right? She has done so much. You're American and Mexican. She's Mexican-American, we could say in a way, right? Okay, bilingual, binational, political analyst, journalist, and media commentator in Mexico, where you've been living since 1986. She holds a master's from Stanford University in Latin American Studies and has written extensively on NAFTA, which I think it'll be interesting to talk about, the drug war, immigration and gender issues. She's written for The Nation, Le Monde, USA Today, The New York Times, Truth Out, and many, many, many others. She also, if that wasn't enough, edits the America's Updater and is a regular columnist for Desinformamos, right? Okay, Foreign Policy and Focus, Counterpunch. Is also commentator for KPFK, Al Jazeera, CGTN, Democracy Now!, NPR, and other Mexican television and radio stations. Wow. She also hosts the TV program Hecho in America and updates from south of the border on the Real News. I could go on. I do feel like adding this last line. She's co-editor of the Confronting Globalization, Economic Integration, and Popular Resistance in Mexico, and has participated as an analyst and activist in the movements against militarization and for human rights on both sides of the border. Bienvenido. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, so anyway, Laura's going to be giving a very great, intense talk about specifically U.S.-Mexico relations, but kind of an overview as well, and beyond, and perhaps a little bit before. And we will have questions right after pertaining to the elections, whatever you feel that maybe you'd like to know more about right after that, okay? So I leave it to you now. Thank you so much, Laura.
Great to be here, really. Thank you so much. It's just a wonderful group, and it's a wonderful reception to be here in this beautiful house. And thanks so much to Connie for that. I'm going to talk as briefly as possible, practically, to open it up to questions. But I do want to give an overview, and I want to give an overview that comes out of this very specific personal experience that Roxanne was talking about. So the beginning of the election period and the campaigns in the United States, of course, we began to notice that at the very heart of Donald Trump's campaign for the presidency in the United States was Mexico. Since when had Mexico been even thought of in the terms of foreign policy, and much less as an issue for a campaign? And as everybody knows, it was not coming up in a good way. Mexico sends thieves and racists to the United States. Mexico is responsible for crime in the United States. Mexico took advantage of us in the free trade agreement, and we're going to fix that. Everything about Mexico is negative. At one point, he even accused some plane flying overhead in a joke to be, some Mexico spy plane. So Mexico became really the boogeyman of the Trump administration, and it had to do with this theory, this strategy of mobilizing a base that was reflecting much more racism than anybody really knew existed in the United States. A huge wake-up call to all of us. And also reflecting a very, very ugly strain of xenophobia. The Mexican government at the time, the Mexican people immediately, of course, repudiated this campaign, this language that was coming out of the electoral process in the United States. And the Mexican government was like, well, what are we going to do about this? But they were in a situation where anything the Mexican government does in terms of defending itself in domestic U.S. politics pretty much turns out to be counterproductive, no matter what the context is, Democratic or Republican. So they kind of were laying low. Then there was the famous faux pas of the Mexican presidency of inviting Donald Trump, thinking, well, this guy could win and we're going to be magnanimous, or whatever they were thinking, to Mexico, in which they gave him a red carpet treatment as a statesman, which he is not, And he immediately, the very same day, flew back to Arizona and gave the most anti-immigrant speech of his entire career, affecting the millions and millions of people who were living already in fear in the United States, of Mexicans living already in fear in the United States. So I began to see this process going on, and it broke my heart. I mean, I was seeing the country where I grew up demonizing the country that had become my home and adopted me, and where my family was raised, and where the people I loved were as well. It was difficult to understand. As a political analyst, I could say, okay, well, the Republican Party has always known that if there's one issue that there's a fairly large consensus on, and it's against immigration among their hardcore base, and so they're going for the wedge issue. And you know, you could sort of explain it that way, but the vitriol, the hatred that was being expressed was something that I certainly hadn't seen before, and I hadn't been expecting. At that time, there were some friends, especially among, I remember a dear friend, Antonio Gonzalez, who ran the Southwest Voters Project for many, many years, and was always involved in Latino vote. And he was coming down, he was talking to all of us and to people in Mexico and saying, you gotta organize, we gotta do something, you have to get involved, because look at this guy who's running for president. We kind of said, yeah, Antonio, we know that, but he doesn't have a chance. You know, people said that up until election night. I covered the elections in the International News Studio in Washington on election night, and the results started coming in, and there were still people, so many people in that room saying, yeah, but he can't pull it off, you know. And then Wisconsin falls, and Florida falls, and then Michigan. And we go, he was going to do it. I was sort of prepared because my heart had already been broken, basically, just by the fact that there was such a large part of the population in the United States that was willing to accept this portrayal of both Mexico and the millions of Mexicans that many of them lived with in their communities. But when the shoe finally dropped, you know, it was a blow for all of us. At that point, there was some efforts. If there's a consensus on anything in Mexico, of course, it's a consensus against Donald Trump. It divides even a polarized society. It unites a polarized society because of the kind of rhetoric and just downright direct insults that have been coming out of there. We did a couple of things, and we started to write and organize and say we've got to first of all protect Mexicans that are living in the United States, because we knew even from the campaign period that this increase in anti-Mexico and anti-immigrant rhetoric was having an on-the-ground impact. There was already documentation of rising hate crimes against Latinos in the United States. We were already getting reports in from all over about the levels of fear that people were living in. There still wasn't a statistical rise in deportation and raids, but that was to come later, and it was just enough to force people to live in fear. We began to see a lot of so-called voluntary returns, but really returns because people couldn't live with that kind of tension in their daily work. And it was odd because I remember we organized a thing called the Caravan Against Fear that went from California to Texas, all across the land border with Mexico, and then back again to try to get a reading of what was happening in the border communities where so many Mexicans live. And I remember asking one person, I said, well, has your life changed since Donald Trump? This is pretty soon after, I think it was April, a couple months after the inauguration, since Donald Trump came to power. And they said, oh, not that much. And then I said, well, do you do anything different? And they go, oh, well, we don't, I can't drive anymore. Well, we don't go to public parks. I mean, these people were literally living inside their houses because of the atmosphere that had been created as a result of this. So we have a series of missteps. In January, many of you will remember that the first executive orders had to do with immigration. and had to do with the crackdowns. There was supposed to be, one of the first binational meetings was supposed to be between President Peña Nieto of Mexico and Donald Trump, and he canceled it because the day before, Trump came out and said Mexico's not doing enough to stop immigration, and we're going to, and came out with the anti-immigrant measures starting right off the bat. So there was increased strain in the relationship, but the attacks just kept coming. No matter how much the Mexican government pretty much caved to this hostility that they were feeling, because the degree of dependency of the Mexican economy on the United States is very high. So especially since NAFTA, we're talking about a nation where 80% of its trade is with a single country. Most of the investment that comes in, and it's become, a country that depends on international investment because it was prioritized above the development of the domestic market in many ways. The degree of dependency, and then you have these chains, like the auto industry, where parts are going back and forth over the border all the time, was so great that they felt that they really could not stand up and say, it's not right what you're saying about our country. And so they didn't, and a lot of Mexicans were very upset about that, and in fact that was one of the factors that explains in part, there are many factors, why people were sick of the government of the ruling party that had been in power for 71 years, except for the 12 years of the Biden administration, and decided for a fairly radical change with now President Lopez Obrador. It was that Mexico was not standing up for the dignity of the country and the dignity of the people. The attacks just kept coming almost on a weekly basis in terms of what was happening to both Mexicans as immigrants in the United States and what was happening in the binational relationship. It's kind of strange because it probably is a reflection of how Mexico has always been thought of as the United States' backyard, that very few people think of Mexico as a foreign policy issue. They tend to go, if you'd say to people, what do you think the top foreign policy issue has been on the Trump agenda? They'll say, well, Iraq, or they'll say someplace in the Middle East, And nobody will say Mexico, and then you say, do you realize that the president has actually mentioned and had measures that directly involve Mexico like about 100 times more than any of those other countries you ever mentioned. So that's one of the really difficult things, and that has to do with the main area that I wanted to talk about before we begin the discussion, which is immigration. Immigration is this weird category because Mexico was in trying to defend its people who were being used as cheap labor and criminalized at the same time. We want you, but we want you in with no rights, basically. That has been the history of Mexican immigration, which is mostly labor immigration, to the United States. Anytime they were trying to say, look, you're violating international labor laws, we've got to do something about what's happening to our people there, the United States government, whether Democratic or Republican, would reply, immigration and control of our borders is a domestic issue. We don't want to hear from you about this. Sometimes there was some dialogue. They thought there could be a breakthrough maybe with people who are pushing for comprehensive immigration reform, and then September 11th happens, and it just evaporated completely from the political agenda. So the United States defined it as a domestic issue. Mexico doesn't know what to do about it. And then it comes up in the Trump administration with a foreign policy that it basically doesn't see countries. It sees borders, especially in our continent. And so Mexico is just a border that keeps them out and us in. And at the same time, expelling a bunch of them who may in fact even be citizens within national territory. It's a clearly white supremacist agenda. There's no other way of putting it. It has to do with whitening up the United States of America And that means keeping people of color, immigrants of color, because you don't see anybody, there's like 100,000 Canadians in the United States who have overstayed their visas. Haven't heard of any campaigns against those immigrants? No. So it has to do
We are
with,
the number one group of people with nationality that has the most people who have overstayed their visas.
yeah.
Number one.
And no, you know, it never comes up. I mean, you know that, I know that, you know, everybody else. So it's definitely, it's clearly racist, it's clearly has to do with this Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump agenda for the future of the United States, and it's a response to the fact that we're in a demographic of diversification. Okay, wait a minute, no? But we're in a demographic of diversification in which, and they've got all their calculations, I'm sure, very well done, there will come a time when wealthy white America is in the minority. And they don't want to let that happen. That's happening. And they do, because there's a lot of people who die because of the border security measures that have taken place. Forcing you to the desert, into the rivers, and we've seen the pictures and the news reports on that. Now what's happening with the issue of immigration has been very, very sad for us in Mexico as well, because this new government that promised to have another paradigm for immigration and also promised to have a different attitude toward, of national sovereignty toward the United States has completely caved. And asylum, and particularly in asylum, because what we've seen is a change in immigration. At the end of last year, to state it very concisely, at the end of last year we began to see these large caravans of Central Americans coming up to the United States. Central America is collapsing. Nobody wants to talk about the political crisis there, but Honduras has a president who was not elected to the presidency, who inherited a military coup, and who is now on trial for drug trafficking in the United States. Not to mention millions and millions of dollars that it's already pretty much proven that he stole from his own government, okay? And then Guatemala has a lame duck president who is a comedian and has been involved also in corruption scandals and has now declared a state of siege to take away civil liberties, especially from indigenous people who are resisting mining projects and other types of projects that take over their land. Complete crisis in Central America that really forces people to leave. This is not just like, oh, I think I can make a few extra dollars in the United States. It's like, you have a death threat, you're out here 24 hours, your family is dead. And a whole series of situations that are completely intolerable for human life, basically. We begin to see this migration coming through in flows that are much larger than we had in the past. And then we see people coming in caravans because it turns out that with the dangers that they face from organized crime in Mexico, it's safer for them. If they can't afford to pay traffickers, they get together and they travel in a group. And at first the government of Mexico was handing out humanitarian visas saying, if you're going to travel through Mexico, do it safely. Don't put yourselves in these areas where there's organized crime and you can be attacked and raped, which is happening way too frequently. I mean, anytime it happens is way too frequently. And they said, we are not going to criminalize migration. And if you're going to we're going to offer work visas for people who want to stay here. And then the threats start coming in. First of all, Donald Trump says, in February, we're going to close the border. Closing the border is like, we're talking about billions of dollars a day that go across the border. Of course, it's also punishment to the United States in a big way. But for Mexico, a weaker economy, more dependent on one country than the United States, it's pretty much death to the economy, even if it happens, even if the border is closed just a few days or hours or whatever, hours, maybe not the days. So then the next threat comes in, but it's pretty much bluff. There's a lot of bluff. But the peso go down, the investors freak out, all the international financial community, the ratings get worse and that kind of thing. That has a direct effect on the economy as well. So the next thing that happens, of course, in the major threat area is in June, the threat of tariffs on Mexican exports. So the Mexican Secretary of Foreign Relations runs up to Washington, sits down and negotiates, comes back. It seems like it's not that bad of a negotiation until the secret part of the negotiation comes out, and it turns out there's 27,000 now, according to Trump, deployment of the National Guard against immigrant flows. This is just a complete reversal of the kind of attitude that Mexico was supposed to have and was going to have toward immigration. And it also implies massive militarization of the country. Yeah.
Before you mentioned the second part, you were talking about the Mexican Secretary of Trade running up to Washington on the tariffs thing.
Foreign Secretary.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
the Foreign Secretary.
Foreign Secretary, oh, okay. But what happened? I mean, what kind of, was there an issue settled there, or was it being reached? Or was it just that I can kiss as far as you can, or what?
Well, we don't know what happened behind closed doors, but that's what I mean, that they came back. Basically, the agreement they came back with says, okay, Mexico doesn't have to be a safe third country. What's a safe third country? It means that it's asylum seekers, because most Central Americans now are formally seeking asylum instead of trying to just go across illegally. It's like suddenly they're doing what they're supposed to do under international law, right? And there's still, and so instead of saying, okay, good, people are doing what they're supposed to do, there's a huge effort to eliminate that as a legal possibility. To eliminate all legal channels for immigration. So a safe third country means if you're an asylum seeker, you flee your country, and if you go through another country that's considered safe for you, you have to seek asylum there and not move on to another one. That meant that all the Central Americans would have to seek asylum in Mexico, and they couldn't even apply for asylum in the United States, despite the fact that many of them have family in the United States. It's where they're most able to integrate into the society. Those kinds of agreements have been really questioned legally. We have one here, you have one here that has gone through court challenges, it has lost court challenges. It doesn't really work, it puts all this stress on Turkey and Greece that are not exactly great places for refugees to be. So, anyway, they come back and they say Mexico's not going to do that, which was like supposedly a point that Mexico won in the negotiation, but that they will help the United States. There's also this other program, ridiculous program, called Remain in Mexico, which Mexico had already accepted, which is that all asylum seekers in the United States are returned to Mexico to await their court date.
Regardless of their nationality.
Right. Well, Mexicans can't be returned to Mexico if they're asylum seekers, but Central Americans and others. Because if you're in Mexico, there's this thing, non-refoulement is like if you're fleeing a country, they can't just send you back without a hearing. But they can send other people back. And so Central Americans is the bulk of the group we're talking about, but they could send back Cubans and Africans and everybody. And they were doing that.
They send
So
Africans to Mexico, are they?
Yeah.
Because they don't entry to entry. Oh, because there's
because they
country
walk
finish.
through Mexico to get to the border. Yeah, and then, but also because under this agreement. Yeah,
Ah.
yeah. So, and their hearings were set for like 3 to 6 months, even longer in the future, because there's such a backlog in the United States, which is another problem, because they're trying to limit, discourage people from even trying to exercise their international rights to asylum. But then it turned out there was other parts to the agreement that involved the deployment of military forces to stop migration flows. It involved raids, like the United States type of raids to catch migrants.
Well, conducted by Mexicans.
Conducted by Mexico. So you begin to see Mexico starting to look like the kinds of.
Yeah, you guys do the dirty work for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, which have been
That sounds
happening
like what's happening
before,
in
but
Turkey
not
with
this.
Syrians, Turkey keeping them in exchange for $9 billion out of Europe.
And we didn't even get the money. You know, and,
Get the money.
Not
there was
yet.
no agreement, it was announced as a unilateral action. According to Rule 253, I think it was, some obscure rule, it said, I can do this, and did it. And Mexico wasn't asked to agree or not, although behind the scenes, they did lift the tariff threat. Behind the scenes, they agreed to. So at that point, you know, it was very clear that Mexico had completely changed its immigration practices because of the fear of it. Essentially what the government in Mexico is doing is saying, in order to make the kinds of transformations that have to do with redistributing wealth, with lowering inequality, with eliminating corruption, these are priorities in the New Mexican government. And they're making a calculation that in order to do this, they have to have a stable macroeconomic environment. And the United States government can do a lot of harm to that stable macroeconomic environment. Every time Donald Trump tweets, the peso goes down. I mean, it's that sensitive. There's an old saying that says if the United States gets a cold, Mexico gets pneumonia. If there's a slight, you know, and when the action goes directly against the country, it's even more pronounced, the kind of response or the kind of reaction it will have. In any case, I think that they overreacted because you can't, first of all, because you just can't enter into a trade-off of like economy for other people's rights. You know, economy for even, you know, a healthy life for families.
Oh, but isn't that the history of the United States from way back in slavery days before this thing was Mexico?
Depends.
Oh, yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
a lot of
every
sense.
country was
We were
built
just
on
kind of
the
hoping that
backs
it
of
wouldn't happen
slaves,
in
yeah.
Mexico, and especially under this government that had promised changes.
The European economy as well, correct?
Yeah. So that's the situation, and this one issue, of course, now has marked relations on every level. It's the free trade agreement was renegotiated. It has some advances in some areas in which it's worse than the old one, but the Mexican government just wants to get it over with again. So we can say, we got this done, you can invest here, everything's cool, nothing's happening, you know? And the same with the immigration issue as well. It's a dynamic which has no end. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, it has no positive outcome for Mexico either. It's like bully behavior. If you give in to a bully, then instead of having him, and I'm kind of using the male pronoun on purpose here, you know, instead of having him leave you alone, you have a situation where he asks and pushes more and more and more and more. And that's what we've seen. Every time the Mexican government says, we're great friends with the United States, we're gonna do this for them, then it gets pushed on more. The fear is that in this, it's almost certainty that in the context of re-election, with again, immigration being a major issue, of course now we have the game changer, which is the Ukraine scandal, but still with immigration being probably as far as we can see, the major issue that he's gonna hit on during this campaign, that things will get worse and worse. They'll get worse for immigrants in the United States, and they'll get worse for Mexico as well. So just to finish up from there, it's gonna be a really important time for other countries to try to stand up. It's almost inevitable that Mexico has to come to a point where it breaks off in some way. Otherwise, the new government would be completely losing the principles that it was elected upon. Not just in the issue of immigration, you know, there has to be a point where Mexico says, we're really not gonna take this anymore. And they're gonna try to do it as low profile as possible. But still, it's gonna be important that other countries are there to support Mexico in this, because it's by far the most vulnerable country in the world to the kinds of policies that Donald Trump is bringing to the United States. And it's going to be very important too, that this issue of immigration, which not only affects Mexico, Central America, our region, which is so important here, is gonna become the emblematic issue for how well we're able to defend human rights in a planet that becomes increasingly difficult because of climate change, because of inequality, and because a lot of the other tendencies that we're seeing. And if we abandon immigrants to their fate in this context, there's no doubt whatsoever in my mind that it's going to be a situation again of then they came for me.
Nice end.
We can all ask questions, but what I think is really fascinating is we get this point of view of U.S.-Mexico relations from the point of view of Mexico, which I think is very unique. You know, usually we'll have Americans talking about it, but we're really getting the inside view from someone who lives in Mexico and what Mexicans are feeling about the Trump policies. And this I found was very, very fascinating, you know, so thank you.
One thing to add
Yes,
is that we are live streaming the event, so we may
Okay.
take a couple questions from the stream.
yeah, this is streaming as we're going on. Lots of questions.
Lots of
Should we do
questions.
one from them first?
Sure.
Let's go for it.
Okay, great. So I have Slim from Louisiana asking a question, and he wants to know how many people the United States can take in, and how does that affect Mexico? Does it help Mexico by American taking Mexicans in?
Yeah, it's a good question because another one of the arguments that's been coming out a lot lately is like there's no vacancy sign on the United States, this gigantic country of millions of people. And that's completely false in terms of the economy. We actually have an economy in the United States of high employment. And we have certain sectors that have traditionally employed migrants. They always say United States people really don't want these jobs. They need these workers. Many of these sectors, especially agriculture and others, are crying out for these workers. So we don't have a number, and the reason, and we should have more of a number, in a sense, because at least for what has to do with labor migration, because it's time to bring it back to a labor issue. You know, to be able to say, we need these workers, they have rights. Let's figure out how we begin to first legalize all the people that are already working in the United States so that they can have full rights. Because also when people have their full rights, when immigrants have their full rights, they're much more productive. They're already paying into the tax system. We already have millions of studies that say immigrants put in way more than they take out, even undocumented immigrants. You know, but they're more productive, they're happier, they're more able to contribute to their communities when they have legal standing in the communities. So that process of regularizing, you know, both the people who are coming in and the people who are already there is critical to having the kind of number that Slim's asking about, and to be able to put some kind of common sense into these laws.
Mm. And is it beneficial for Mexico? Because that was his
Yeah, Mexico also has a tremendous capacity to absorb these people. These are not record flows. This is not a surge. This is not an invasion. There have been many points in history when there are more people coming up during the Dirty Wars, you know, where there was really more widespread war environment. There were more people coming up from Central America than what we see now. In Tijuana, I've been working a lot in Tijuana. It's a booming border city, and people are coming to the shelters to hire immigrants there all the time, and there's nobody in the population. There's some xenophobic reactions that the mayor, in this case, has whipped up, but there's really nobody in the population saying an immigrant took my job, you know? And with the right kinds of policies and the right kinds of laws, there's really no reason whatsoever that it can't be absorbed. Now then, that doesn't mean that that should be the only policy response, because again, we're talking about forced migration. And nobody should live in a situation where they don't have the right to stay in their own home. You know, Hondurans, Guatemalans, they want to stay there, but they want to live in an environment where they can raise their kids. They love their countries, you know, where they can raise their kids, where they can make a living and not be threatened by either state or gang violence. So that part of the problem has to be dealt with too.
Elliot?
Yeah. Relating to the last point you made, about Honduras and El Salvador and so on, violence in that situation. What can the United States do, assuming the stars align, we do our duty and we have a democratic government in 2020? What can the United States do, either with the governments there or through NGOs, to improve the lives of those people?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say that I think we should always have a stars aligned scenario. Because otherwise we lose our vision. You know, if you get into the pragmatism of like, oh, let's not even think about that, which is the correct response because it's not politically viable, you begin to lose your vision of what's right and wrong in a sense. You know? So the stars aligned scenario, I don't have, you know, a full answer to that. And unfortunately, there's certainly not problems that you can resolve overnight. But one thing that I think is really important to mention is that there are a lot of people who are saying we've got to give more aid to Central America. Trump cut off aid. Yesterday, he said he was restoring it, but only in the areas that interested him, like border control and militarization and mega projects that actually displace people. But in Honduras, because I was there last month, what people are saying is please stop all aid because it's going to a dictator. And in order for us to get rid of this illegitimate government, we can't have him being propped up by foreign governments, which is essentially what foreign aid is doing now. So there's the Berta Cáceres was an environmental, feminist, internationalist activist, indigenous Lenca from Honduras, who was assassinated for opposing a hydroelectric dam and being very outspoken. She won the Goldman Prize. She was very well known internationally. In fact, we thought that that kind of a high-profile person would be protected from a state-sponsored assassination, and she was not. So they sponsored a lot of people in Congress. They're sponsoring what's called the Berta Cáceres Act, which would suspend aid to Honduras, all security aid to Honduras. So that's really important. And the other kinds of things is it's time for the United States to take a real critical look at where its aid has been going and what it's been doing. Because so much of it has been exacerbating exactly the types of problems that people are fleeing from.
A second part of the question, if I might, assuming the stars align, again, what are the priorities a Democratic president and Congress should take to undo the damage that the current administration has done?
Again, you know, there's a lot of groups that work on this. All the groups like Constitutional Rights and ACLU that have been challenging these asylum decisions in the courts. They've won a number of the decisions. Otherwise, the situation would be even worse than it is. And so, they have a lot of more like really nitty-gritty responses to that kind of question. But clearly, you have to eliminate. You know, Donald Trump has been doing almost all these measures by executive order or decree, which indicates that he knows that he can't go through Congress on it, and they're being blocked in the courts, but, you know, he's doing everything he can to push it through to eventually stack the courts in a way that he won't have a counterweight in the judicial system either. The only advantage to that is if they're done by decree, they can be undone by executive order as well. So that's gonna be number one, and you can just go down the line, basically, and say all this anti-immigrant, xenophobic stuff is no longer, you know. Undo the Remain in Mexico program. There's a huge area in which that could be done. The issue of comprehensive immigration reform is more complicated, and of course it all depends on what kind of control you have in Congress as well.
Sure. Thank you.
You seem to indicate that Mexico is kind of just at the whim of the United States. But my question is, what kind of leverage does Mexico have, and in particular the López Obrador government have, vis-a-vis the United States? Because one of the things that comes to mind, but I'd like to know if you agree, and if you have other ideas as well, is that the more Mexico becomes like the Turkey of Europe, in sort of protecting or becoming the holding pen of the ailing immigrant population of all of Central and South America, the more leverage it has in opening or closing the spigot, and the more it seems to me to be in a position to ask for something in exchange, and therefore have leverage. So if you can answer that in terms of immigration and in terms of just the relations between the two, as well, that'd be interesting.
I mean, I don't think it has, and we have to be consistent with our beliefs too, which are that foreign countries shouldn't interfere in the internal politics of another. But in that sense, except for demanding that they respect international conventions that they've signed on to. But in that sense, I think more than leverage in the United States, I think it has a greater capacity to stand on its own feet than this government appears to be giving it credit for. The other part of the question, though, in terms of using the immigration issue, I think it's unwise to use immigration as a threat. Because if you use immigration as a threat, like, okay, we're going to, tell all these people to go to the United States because we can't deal with them
It's like
here.
A-bombs, you don't use them, you just have them.
Yeah, but again, you're feeding into a whole narrative of immigration as a problem and as a negative thing when that's not really true, and you really want to avoid that. What we've learned over the years is that when you change the discourse on an issue, even before you change the policies on an issue, you're giving up significant ground in a battle. What do I mean by that? I mean, look at all the Democratic administrations that said, okay, we're gonna trade off border security for comprehensive immigration reform. There was an active trade-off. We'll give you this, you give us that. Of course, they never got it. And meanwhile, not only was it this just enormous waste of resources on border security for a threat that's non-existent, because immigrants are not a threat, but but we lost this whole battle of putting immigration into this national security paradigm. And we began to cause deaths by forcing people to go into the desert. There was a huge loss in terms of supporting those in a so-called pragmatic equation that was going to get the other. So you want to avoid doing that at all costs. And even when it doesn't, and it has to do with the stars align scenario, even when it might not seem like the pragmatic Washington thing to do, make sure you're consistent with your principles and your language on that. As a communicator, we're very conscious of it, this whole battle against illegal aliens and the kinds of phrases that, they're not just phrases, they create images in people's head, and those images feed into stereotypes and the kinds of attitudes that lead to somebody grabbing a machine gun, driving 10 hours, and milling down mostly Mexican Americans in a Walmart in El Paso.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
Okay, my question is about, I guess, a stars aligned type of scenario where we're looking to take immigration outside of the rubric of security. In other words, although you could trace back at least 30 years the moment when immigration started to become the object of lots of fear-mongering and militarization along the border stuff, you could take this back to the Clinton years, in fact, and Newt Gingrich, etc. There was a major change that occurred when everything came up, when all the immigration services were placed under the heading of DHS, the Homeland Security, which wasn't always the case. Some of it was managed by Justice before, etc. Is there any hope, do you think, of in a decently conceived democratic program to take immigration outside of the security domain? Is anybody mentioning that? Do you know of any Democratic candidates who have more vision in this area than others?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know in detail all the candidates' immigration plans, but, well, first of all, if you create if you legalize the people who are in the country now, then they become full citizens, they become full actors in their communities, and they vote, which is precisely why they don't want to legalize them. They're already there, they're already paying taxes, they're already working, they're already friends of friends, you know? And, but it's really voting that they're afraid of, for the same reason that they're disenfranchising black people all over the country right now with the kinds of crazy restrictions that they're putting up. So that would be a huge step that changes the way a democracy works, because all of a sudden everybody who's part of it is fully part of it. And then for example, Julian Castro, what he says is that there's a specific law that changed immigration from being an administrative fault or infraction to being a crime, and then eventually felony in certain circumstances, which section 232, or I'm not really sure about the number. But Julian Castro has been very clear, we're gonna get rid of this section and we're gonna decriminalize immigration.
Which Beto O'Rourke had refused to consider. Is that
Yeah,
right?
other
Debate, that's what it
candidates
came out,
have
yeah.
not gone that far,
Yeah.
you know, they've talked about reform, but they haven't gone to decriminalization.
Excuse me, but I think we should criminalize the employers of the illegal immigrants.
Yeah,
They've
oh,
tried
that will
that.
never happen.
Well,
Well,
I
they
mean,
have
it's
done
just
it.
right.
I mean, there's like the what's it called, they have done it.
E-Verify.
Because it ends up, you know, firing, it ends up, a lot of people losing their jobs. It's,
Nothing happens to the employer. But
Well,
those people
done it
vote,
already.
those employers, I mean, there would be pressure put on the government. Well, of course, the companies, the farms that employ illegal immigrants.
but they're, in some ways, they're in the same bind. They need the labor, they can't get their workers legalized, some of them try and
Yeah, I know
maybe,
there's some-
but now there's a huge backlog. And so, you know, really, I mean, we just don't wanna make anything that has to do with immigration and working for a living.
Well, you always want some kind of slaves, you know.
That's a problem, they want workers that don't have rights.
Cousin in Houston told his kid's nanny that if she went to the protests, you know, several years ago to demonstrate to Americans how dependent we were on Hispanic labor, you know, that she would be fired. You know,
Yeah.
she'd raised the babies, who were now 10-year-old children, and you know, they want those people there, and they want them to be outside the law, and regularization also means that they would pay taxes, and we're talking about a layer of society that doesn't want taxes paid. They want to bankrupt the government and run the country as warlords.
Yeah.
So in fact, they
also
want.
are paying some kind of taxes, but I was trying to remember who I was talking to. It's a union it's actually a service union, but they work with construction workers. And so they said they have a local in Arizona, and they said that like something like 80% of the people who were building the wall there are undocumented workers.
It's so crazy. It's so crazy.
And I would like to remind people that practically all our fruits and vegetables and meat are touched, harvested, or canned, or whatever you call it, in the butcher things in the factories by undocumented workers. Not all, like, at least 80% every day. Every grape, every strawberry, each piece of cauliflower that you may eat in the United States is harvested by mostly by Mexicans and some people from Honduras, Nicaragua, like that. And it's been like that for years.
Yeah.
Yeah, but some of them are documented.
Some are documented, but not all of them.
Yeah.
Is it better to say, it's not better to say immigrants than asylum seekers in the communications, right?
They're very different. They're
Yeah,
formally
it's
different, yeah.
different. So
They-
why
we're
we're
talking,
talking-
the Central Americans now are mostly asylum seekers.
Yeah.
And that's a group. So basically, you know, they decided to go through the legal channels. And they've got this problem where, first of all, they're not allowed to cross the border to request asylum. There's a process called metering. which means there are thousands of
Metering,
people
yes,
metering, you know, there's
Yes, yes,
thousands of
yes.
people waiting to go across the border and request asylum. And they take like 2 or 3 a day or something, so that's building up and building up. Yeah, and that's
Sort of
because.
follow up on that?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Just, so then, do we have numbers on how many are asylum seekers versus people you would say as immigrants?
Well, there's 3 categories. So there's asylum seekers, there are numbers about, but they're like very reduced from the demand because they're taking so few. And there's, I don't know the exact figure now, but there's like a huge backlog of cases too. It's ridiculous.
It's in the hundreds of thousands, yeah?
Yeah, like 800,000.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's asylum seekers. Asylum seeker can either cross the border at a port of entry, say to the border patrol, I'm seeking asylum, or they can cross the border at a non-port of entry and deliver themselves immediately to authorities and say, I'm seeking asylum. It's the same, Trump tried to say you can't do that outside the port of entry, but it got struck down in the court. So there's asylum seekers, and most of the families from Central America are going through this way. It's hard to say most, because that's the second category, which is immigrants. So if you're an immigrant, there are visa workers programs, but we're talking about a couple thousand, a very small percentage that actually get a visa. They go into through the H2A or H2B programs to work on a certain farm, and they have their visa to work seasonally there. Okay, that's a very small group. And then the immigrants then, so they don't have a visa and they're not asking for asylum, so they have to stay across the border. So there's no way of measuring them, except they generally track at least tendencies. They generally take apprehensions at the southwest border as a sort of a measure for the number of immigrants. And they're extremely low.
Why wouldn't everybody just say that they're asylum seekers? Because you have to prove it.
And because they're having to wait for a year to
Oh,
just
that's
even
right.
cross the
Oh,
border and
that's
have their first hearing, and then they get sent back
Okay.
for another.
Well,
Yeah, so now we're gonna
Oh.
see more people trying to go across the border, which means more deaths in the desert, which means less of a registry of who's where and what's happening. You know, it's the opposite of what somebody who wanted to enforce the law at the border would really want.
Right.
But they don't, that's not what they're doing.
Are there consequences for a false asylum claim?
Oh, yeah.
It just gets rejected.
It's-
I mean, it's not false, well, if it's a lie or something,
Well, yeah, I mean, like, her point is, like, could anybody do it? Because, like, I know some people that are, like, deported and stuff, like, they get barred from re-entry. I don't know if that applies to false claims of asylum or not. Like, if they determine your claim is
no,
economic.
if you get rejected one time because your claim doesn't have substance.
Yeah, they say it's like, you're an economic migrant and not an asylum seeker.
I'm not sure if anybody would really go back and try again after they'd be rejected. They would either decide to just go home or request asylum in Mexico or sneak across, or just cross the border. I mean, I think that'd be.
Yeah, my question is about when if someone crosses the border, this is the question about whether it's a criminal act. Today it's criminal to do that, right? If you cross the border. Well,
was
it's
struck
not-
down
sorry,
as a
no, no,
court
what,
outside
no,
of
no,
the mystery.
No, but I mean, what illegally, that's what I'm trying to say. If you cross the border, and, is it today, you are a criminal to cross the border if, sneaking, I mean, what is your status when you cross the border and you haven't?
Caught.
Well, you haven't requested, you're not waiting for asylum, and anyway, if you're waiting for asylum, you haven't crossed the border, now you're waiting in Mexico, I think now, right?
Yeah, so it's against the law.
So it's against the law.
Yeah.
So,
If it's not your first time
Is
you've been
it-
caught before, then it's more
is
serious.
it-
It becomes a
Yeah.
crime.
Are you, if you're not a criminal, I mean, you're a criminal today, if you change that law and it's not a criminal, what is it then?
Well, it's,
Civil-
yeah, it's,
civil
well,
violation.
it's just, you go back to the practice of before, which they disparagingly call catch and release. The practice before was very commonsensical. It's like, you cross the border, you don't have papers to be here, go back. And they send you back over the border. But now, there's a couple things that are happening. The main thing that's happening is that what they found, the justification for it is that when that happened to people, they were likely to, or many were likely to come back and try again. But anyway, so now what's happening is that for many years, not just the Trump administration, people who cross the border and are caught are sent to detention centers. So why are they sent to detention centers? Number one, because, that are like prisons. Number one, because they find that it's more dissuasive in terms of crossing again. But a big reason is because these are private detention
Good
centers
business.
that are charging the government hundreds of dollars a day to have immigrant living in terrible conditions. And it's become a big business. And this happens to be a big business that donates expansively to the Republican Party and specifically to Donald Trump.
And if you weren't, if we change law and you're not a criminal, what would you be then?
Deported.
I'm sorry,
So
what did you
there's
say?
civil-
No, no, what did
You'd
you
be
say?
an undocumented.
Deported.
What is that? What do you
I mean,
mean
if they
deported?
caught you, they would send you back.
If it's not a crime, it would be a civil violation.
Civil violation.
There you go.
Civil violation.
Yeah, it used to be what they
It's a
call.
civil violation, okay.
Yeah,
Misdemeanor violation.
yeah, and the exact legal format, you would have to ask the lawyer. 'Cause
All
I
right.
mean, there's probably a very, very specific
Okay.
term for it.
Right.
Yeah.
The guy right in the back, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to ask about the detention centers because we haven't touched on it before now.
Yeah.
What would you comment on those from a foreign policy standpoint and an international humanitarian law standpoint on the detention centers and the current situation within the border?
The detention centers have been, there was just recently a report by Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the United Nations, condemning the whole system of detention centers in the United States. They shouldn't even exist because even if you do have a series of laws that criminalize immigration, that doesn't mean that these people, it basically means that they, okay, you don't have the right papers, you go back, it doesn't mean that they should be held in these conditions. And then you have the circumstances, right now, one of the biggest changes that the Trump administration wants to make, because it's already made all these other changes, to get rid of what's called the Flores settlement, which said that you can't keep children in these conditions more than a certain amount of time.
Yes.
And so they want to get rid of this so they can have entire families in detention for huge amounts of time. And
All for money.
every step, everything about immigrant detention centers is a violation of human rights.
It's all for profit.
It's also dissuade as well.
So here's what I've been curious about. Forgive me if this question was asked in a different way before, but I guess it's a two-parter. One, what would you say, or what has the president, you say it's Lopez Obrador?
Yeah.
Okay. What is his agenda right now to kind of mitigate the current situation happening at the border? Because of course, the United States is obviously culpable for a lot of things that are happening along its border, and perhaps even what's happening in Central America. But what is his agenda to mitigate the situation within Mexico itself, with regards to how our actions as Americans are affecting the Mexican economy and even the migrant crisis as it currently exists?
Well, that's a big problem because the agenda seems to be whatever the United States government says so far. I mean, the long-term agenda has been very clear about, and it has to do with development in Central America. But again, the way that it's conceived of is propping up illegitimate governments in Central America because it's an aid program. There's a program to sow fruit trees in El Salvador, which is completely misguided. Number one, because fruit trees don't even produce for 5 years, and people are leaving because they have to leave now, And number two, because it doesn't go to the structural roots of the kinds of violence that we're seeing in these countries. So that's, but they call going to the roots, encouraging development in Central America. This is the main platform. They just created a new commission that's what they're gonna be working. The other one is they say they are going to provide, work visas to people who are in Mexico, and they're continue to provide asylum. But the asylum system in Mexico is currently completely collapsed. It has a backlog that's almost as big as the backlog in the United States. There have been protests because particularly African and Haitian refugees who are waiting for asylum in Mexico were put in a detention center, you know, US style, and they had no prospect of when they were actually gonna be able, they couldn't work, they couldn't even be free people, basically. And they've been protesting for their rights, and they've been met with repression. So we're still seeing, you know, a copy of a lot of the policies of the United States government, and even though formally the Mexican government denies this and says it wants to do something different, we're not seeing either, you know, a comprehensive plan for this. And like I say, I mean, it's the Haitians and Africans right now that have gotten the worst of it in many ways too, because they're supposedly, you know, doing what they're supposed to be doing, and yet they're in this big detention center on the southern border of Mexico, and as if it weren't bad enough, I mean, the refugee system was already backlogged before the recent large groups of people began to come through. And then in the earthquake at the end of 2017, it destroyed the area where they worked. And so they actually, you know, hung a sign up and said closed until closed for remodeling or something. They were literally in a shambles, and they haven't even recovered to a normal working level, and they need to be at like 10 times what was their former normal working level.
So with regards to the detention centers, this is part two. You know, I know before I came here, we've been having a big debate back home with regards to the, you know, with ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, if I'm not mistaken. There's been a lot of talk about, you know, abolish ICE and all this other stuff, and I looked into it, and from what I understand, ICE didn't even exist before 2003. So what would you say, in your opinion, are some of the more comprehensive steps that the federal government can take in the event that, you know, God willing, we do get a Democratic administration in the coming year or so, to, if not abolish, but completely reorganize the way ICE operates as a governmental entity?
I mean, in my opinion, they should abolish it because now it has this reputation of being an enemy of the people, basically, because immigrants are people in our country, in the United States. And yeah, well, some of the things that I mentioned, it's like legalize the people who are there, have been working, get rid of the backlog, just go through it, and people who are going through the channels to request their green card, so you can unite families, because strong families make a strong society. If we were to go back, if this situation were normal, there are a lot of people, immigrants in the United States, who would like to go back to their home country. But if it means never seeing their children, who are now established in the United States again, they're not gonna do that. There used to be a more circular rotation, which met the needs of labor. It was still not full working rights for a lot of the people, but it was a much more fluid situation, which seems to be kind of the natural situation for our region, and always has been from the days of the Aztecs, that there's a migration according to where you can make your livelihood, no matter what the borders are and that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, it requires a lot of thinking about all the alternatives, and hopefully we will be in a position where we can get to that point and say, okay, here's what we're gonna do now. And there are other people too, there are other organizations that are more brass tacks on that question specifically.
What is Mexican public opinion of Obrador and how he's handling these issues? And also, what, from the Mexican perspective, how well has the alternative to NAFTA been negotiated?
On the first question, you know, there's, everyone who works in immigration is very upset about this, and everyone who works in human rights is very upset about this. In the general public, he still has a high degree of popularity. He's still riding on a kind of a honeymoon period on that,
It's been
where
a year
people
now?
are not gonna say,
Little over a
yeah,
year.
on December 1st, so people are not gonna say they agree with this immigration policy necessarily, but they're still going to support the president. It hasn't become like a widespread public issue in terms of defense of migrant rights, or even defense of a different type of relationship with the United States. So basically, you know, people are not happy about it, but they support the president. That was the first part. What was the second part?
And then NAFTA, from a
Oh,
Mexican
yeah.
point of view, how well does that renegotiate? Or whatever it's called.
Yeah, and so now it's the USMCA. People followed it, you know, I can't speak for like all Mexicans obviously either. But it's not a huge issue there. They feel like, the way it was the first time it was negotiated in many ways. They feel like, I think a lot of people, and this goes for the negotiators, the governments as well, the former Mexican government, the new one, they're basically, when Donald Trump decided to renegotiate NAFTA, figured, okay, we're gonna be in damage control mode. And instead of like having a vision for how are we gonna remake the U.S.-Mexico relationship in the forms of economic integration, which we could have done, you could definitely have a much better, you know, NAFTA and form of integration. They were just like, how do we keep from getting completely screwed over here? And then there were some things that are actually considered wins for the idea of having sanctions for hyper exploitation of workers in Mexico is basically more than accepted. You know, they want to see, the government wants to raise wages, the people obviously want wages to go up. And the way that it was finally negotiated is not like extremely heavy-handed in terms of specific U.S. involvement and that kind of thing. So that seemed as something that was a shared goal.
Has there ever been good government in Mexico?
No, not yet. I mean, because remember, there was 71 years of one-party rule, authoritarian one-party rule. There was a lot of hope that it was a conservative, right-wing government that came to power that broke that. And even so, a lot of people thought, well, at least they'll be able to dismantle this structure of authoritarian control. But they immediately came to an agreement with the former ruling party that in order to maintain the economic system and the elite that really had control in the country, they would not touch the system, you know, the corrupt system of authoritarian control that existed beforehand. So there were two administrations of that kind of government in which things were still intact. So right now what we're seeing is really the first attempt to begin to break that down, and it's incredibly complex. Because it's daily life, you know, it's daily interactions. A cop stops you in the street, asks you for 500 pesos and you drive on, because if you don't, you know, you have to take your, I mean, it's just like, there's just so many levels of corruption. Some of it's deadly, and some of it's annoying, and some of it's profoundly draining, you know, but there's all kinds of levels of corruption.
My question is along those lines. To what extent does AMLO really control the army and the troops that were being sent to the border? Is that his decision, or was that something influenced by the United States saying as part of this agreement, well, we might not be able to know exactly, but it seems like something that the United States would have said that you must send your troops, and does he have a choice, and does he have more leverage with the army, or is there tension?
Well, there are direct military relations, but in this case, it's something the United States asked of Mexico, but then he has to give the order. He gave the order. He takes responsibility for this decision. to deploy the Army in that sense. And it's interesting what he's been doing, because the Army, ever since it was launched into the drug war at the end of 2006, has compiled a huge number of human rights violations and extrajudicial executions, and there's still, amid everything, one of the institutions that has a higher level of respect in the country. Because the police are even more corrupt, which is why they deployed the Army in the first place for that kind of thing. But the relationship between the president and the armed forces has been interesting, because nobody expected that, given their reputation as human rights violators and being armed forces with a government that was supposed to privilege, dialogue and that kind of thing. But he has been absolutely and completely, praising the Army and touting the closeness between the armed forces and the government itself. Now, he has officially said that the Merida Initiative, which was the drug war alliance between the United States and Mexico, is over. But there doesn't seem to be any particular indication that it's over, because the war is being carried out pretty much in the same way it always has. So there was a huge fight in Mexican society just to create the National Guard, because at first it seemed like a framework for legalizing the participation of the armed forces in domestic crime control. And that had already been rejected by the force of public opinion and mobilization under 2 previous administrations. So when they presented something that looks similar with the creation of the National Guard, there was a huge outcry. They went to a dialogue. They opened up space for public dialogue. They modified the law, and everybody was happy with it. But then the first thing the president does is name a general as the leader of it, completely against this concept that it was going to be a civil force, and deploy it to hunt down Central American migrants. So now everybody's just like,
Can you explain that?
Oh, thank you. Fantastic talk. I'm learning a lot. Since you have experience about looking at this issue from both sides of the border, I was hoping you can help me clarify a mystery that I've had for the last couple of years. And that question is, why in the border states of the United States, Arizona and Texas, where you have a lot of American voters that have Hispanic heritage, Central American, Mexican heritage, but they don't seem to be as motivated to go to the polls against this current president. Can you explain why that is, and maybe what the Democratic Party can do to mobilize those voters to get them to the polls?
yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and there's a couple things. First of all, there's the high number of undocumented people who are there as part of the communities who can't. Second of all, there's a certain amount of apathy. I think they do have a pretty low voting rate in general, which is something that has to be directed, that has to be dealt with through education and programs that are very directly, focused on this group in particular. But the third one is kind of interesting. It's that there are 3rd and 4th generations. Remember, this part of the country was Mexico, right? And so there are people who've been there forever. There are families who have been there forever, and all of a sudden they just found themselves on the other side of the border because the border moved, not them. So, yeah. And there are a large number apparently of individuals among that particular sector that feels like more recent immigrants threaten what they have.
More so in Texas than in Arizona.
Yeah. And so you do find attitudes where Mexican Americans that have been there a long time and have the full rights feel that if new immigrants are granted, they've seen what's happened as a response to people coming into the country, and instead of blaming, this change in attitude on the part of the country and its rulers, they said like, whoa, these guys are rocking the boat. Yeah, that's kind of the attitude, because they may not be in the most stable economic or whatever position anyway, even though they've been there forever. And so it's like, these guys are rocking the boat. All of a sudden, we're being targeted too because there's this whole anti-immigrant and anti-Mexican sentiment being whipped up. And their first response, and for some people anyway, it's just like,
Do you think there could ever be a population exchange such as was the subject of a lecture that we attended a few days ago? The big population exchange between Turkey and Greece, where people by the millions, regardless of their nationality, but just on the basis of religion, but religion could be used instead of race could be used instead of religion or language or where your ancestors came from. Going back to the question, do you think there could ever be a forced population exchange as there has been in Europe and relatively recently by the millions? And do you think that something like that could happen in the States in the so-called right context of climatic change, economic downturn, and effective misinformation?
I can't envision something like that, at least in the current context.
What would it take?
Apocalypse.
There's no one to exchange with.
Okay, this is gonna be our last question. Okay, we can have a discussion around the wine later. This young lady did have a question, so hasn't been asked a question. Go ahead.
So you talked about going to border towns and kind of a market increase in fear in the communities you're talking to. But when I look at like, the Obama administration, they deported more people than the Trump administration. So is that due to kind of a difference in rhetoric, or are the policies poor, or like what is that market change causing?
Yeah, well, at the time, since it was just a few months after the Trump administration came to power, it was definitely caused by the rhetoric. And I think people were surprised because the actual deportation numbers that first year were pretty low and considerably lower than the Obama. Although also there was pretty high detention numbers because they were still doing that thing of like making some money off them before they actually deported them. And they still are.
A higher percentage under Trump of deportation of non-criminal migrants than in the last few years under Obama.
Yeah, because in their Obama, they tried to focus it that way too. And so now, but I think the fear continues, and now we are starting to see a rise in deportation. But yeah, many people, and rightfully so, emphasize the fact that these policies aren't new, that Obama was the deporter-in-chief. This is often the phrase that's used, and numerically that continues to be true, although we're still expecting that to change as now the Trump machinery gets into place and they are starting to do more deportations.
Okay, I'm gonna have to end now, but we have a little bit of wine left and we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much, Laura. This has been enjoy the last bits of wine and you can ask a lot of questions that you may have that you weren't able to. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.
And again, we are asking for voluntary donations if you have anything there to help pay for the cost of the event and the organization as a whole.